Welcome to Mr. Hutchings History, where the past comes alive. Let's dive into today's story.
All right, get ready because today we're diving into a topic that might surprise you. Canada's role in the Vietnam War. I know what you're thinking, Canada. Vietnam. Weren't they like totally neutral and all that?
Yeah, most people assume they just sat that one out, eh?
But the truth is a little more complicated than that. A lot more complicated.
Yeah.
Get ready for a story of diplomacy and economic ties and internal conflict. By the end of this, you'll see how even a country that didn't send troops can get tangled up in a war.
It's one of those stories that seems simple at first glance, but the deeper you dig, the more you realize how complex and interesting it really is.
Okay, so let's go back, way back to 1954. The Geneva Agreements, this big attempt to make peace in Vietnam after years of French rule, are signed. And Canada, all idealistic and ready to make a difference, joins the International Control Commission. That's the ICC, right?
Yep, the ICC.
What exactly were they supposed to do?
Well, they had a huge job overseeing those agreements, trying to keep the peace, managing the division of Vietnam, and planning for elections. All this with the Cold War heating up in the background.
Man, talk about a tough job. And then you've got the U.S., Canada's closest ally, starting to get more and more involved in the region.
Yeah, that really put Canada in a tough spot. They were supposed to be neutral, but how do you stay neutral when your best buddy is jumping headfirst into a conflict you're supposed to be mediating?
So right away, we see this tension for Canada. They want to be peacemakers, but global politics aren't that simple.
Exactly. And it gets even more complicated when Lester B. Pearson becomes Prime Minister in 1963. Now, this is where things get interesting. Pearson was a Nobel Peace Prize winner. He really believed in peaceful solutions.
Wait, hold on. A Nobel Peace Prize winner leading a country that's basically helping a war effort doesn't really add up.
It's pretty ironic, isn't it? Even before becoming prime minister, Pearson was openly criticizing Kennedy's military approach. He was saying that the U.S. was getting into a mess, they couldn't win. And then in 1965, he gives this huge speech at Temple University in Philadelphia on U.S. soil. He calls for the bombing to stop and for peace talks to start.
So he's like directly criticizing U.S. foreign policy right in their backyard. I bet that went over well.
Let's just say President Johnson was not happy. They had a pretty tense meeting at Camp David after that speech. It really shows how much this was straining things between Canada and the U.S.
So Canada's trying to balance its alliance with the U.S. and its own belief in peace.
Exactly. And it gets even harder when you look at the economics of it all. Behind the scenes, Canada was pretty deep in the American military-industrial complex.
You mean there's more to this than just diplomacy and peace talks?
Oh yeah, a lot more. Canadian companies were sending tons of stuff to the U.S. military. We're talking $2.5 billion worth of arms, equipment, all that. It was a huge boost for the Canadian economy, created jobs, made money. During the 60s, it wasn't easy to just walk away from that.
Wow, I had no idea they were so involved on that level.
And then it gets even more ethically tricky when you add in the fact that Canada was also involved in making Agent Orange and napalm, which they then tested and gave to the U.S.
Hang on, Agent Orange. The stuff that caused all those horrible health problems in Vietnam.
Yeah, that Agent Orange. Canada helped make it, even though they knew the risks. It kind of makes you question how sincere they were about being peacemakers, you know?
Yeah, saying one thing and doing another.
Yeah.
Makes their whole peacemaker image seem a little fake.
It definitely created a lot of internal conflict within Canada. Around 30,000 Canadians volunteered to fight in Vietnam with U.S. troops. So clearly, people were divided on this.
So you've got this disconnect. The government's policy, the economic interests, and then what individual citizens are choosing to do. Canada's trying to please everyone and ends up in this really morally gray area.
A very gray area. And on top of all that, Canada even let the U.S. military train on Canadian soil. So even though they weren't officially in the war, they were definitely helping the U.S. out.
It's like this whole secret network of support, running counter to their image as neutral peace lovers.
And that network gets even more tangled up when you consider the American draft dodgers who fled to Canada. Over 30,000 of them came to Canada to avoid fighting a war they thought was wrong.
Wow, that really changes the idea of Canada just standing by and doing nothing. Thousands of young men crossing the border to escape a war they want no part of.
It was a huge deal for Canada, both culturally and in terms of their relationship with the U.S. President Nixon wanted Canada to send them back, but when Pierre Trudeau became Prime Minister in '68, he said no.
That's a pretty bold move. It sounds like Trudeau was saying Canada makes its own choices even if the U.S. doesn't like them.
It was a big moment for Trudeau and for Canada. It showed they were willing to stand up to the U.S. even on something as important as the Vietnam War.
So on the one hand, you've got Canada giving refuge to these draft dodgers and refusing to send them back. But on the other hand, they're giving economic and logistical support to the very war they're fleeing. It's all very confusing.
It is. And it gets even more twisted when you factor in the covert operations. The RCMP, Canada's federal police, were actually giving information about the draft dodgers in Canada to the CIA and FBI.
Are you serious? They were helping the U.S. track down the same people they were giving sanctuary to. Talk about mixed signals. It makes you wonder what was really motivating Canada during this time. Were they idealists? Were they pragmatists? Or were they just trying to do everything at once?
That's a question historians are still debating. And to really understand how complicated Canada's role was, we need to look at what was happening within the country itself, especially the rise of the anti-war movement in Canada.
So we've got this picture of Canada playing both sides, huh? Giving refuge to draft dodgers, but also working with U.S. intelligence, speaking out against the war, but also making money from it. What were Canadians themselves thinking about all of this?
Well, just like in the U.S., the anti-war movement was getting bigger and bigger in Canada throughout the 60s. Protests were happening all over, especially in Quebec, where groups like the FLQ saw Vietnam as just another example of a powerful country bullying a weaker one.
The FLQ, that's the Front de Libération du Québec, right?
That's the one. They even tied the anti-war movement to their own fight for Quebec to become independent.
So the Canadian anti-war movement had its own unique flavor, connected to what was happening in Canada itself. It wasn't just a copycat of the U.S. movement.
Right. But there was definitely a feeling of solidarity between activists in Canada and the U.S. They both wanted the war to end and believed in finding peaceful solutions. They organized protests, demonstrations, rallies, all kinds of things across Canada, just like what was happening in the U.S.
Can you give us a sense of what those protests were like? What were people demanding? How did the Canadian government react?
Picture this. University campuses are buzzing with debates and teach-ins. Public squares are packed with people chanting slogans, and marches are going on for blocks and blocks. People from all walks of life were part of this. Students, professors, union members, even some religious groups. They were all speaking out against the war. Some of them wanted Canada to use its position on the ICC to push for a ceasefire, while others wanted Canada to cut off all ties with the war effort, even the economic ones.
It's amazing to think that a war happening so far away could cause such a strong reaction in Canada. It really shows how some issues are so big they affect everyone, everywhere.
It also shows how powerful everyday people can be when they come together to challenge the government and change public opinion. The anti-war movement in Canada definitely forced the government to at least think about the ethics and the politics of what they were doing.
Okay, so we've got this really complicated story. Canada as a diplomat trying to make peace, Canada as a business partner making money, Canada as a safe haven for draft dodgers, and Canada as a place where people are actively protesting the war. It's a lot to take in. How do historians even begin to explain all this? How do they interpret what Canada's role was in the Vietnam War?
Well, that's where it gets even more interesting. Historians have come up with a bunch of different ways of understanding what Canada did during this time, and their views are often shaped by their own personal beliefs and how they approach research. It makes for a really rich and varied picture.
So walk us through those different schools of thought. What are the main arguments and what makes them different?
All right, first up, we have the Orthodox historians. They tend to focus on the diplomacy and the peacekeeping side of things. They look at people like Pearson and how much he criticized the war. They point to Canada not sending combat troops and their efforts on the ICC as evidence that Canada was truly committed to peace. Think of it like the classic Canada the peacemaker story.
So they're focusing on the idealistic part, the idea that Canada was trying to do the right thing and make the world a better place.
Exactly. But then you have the revisionist historians. They come in and say, hold on a minute, don't forget about all the money being made. They challenge that whole peacemaker image and argue that Canada's public statements against the war were just a cover for their economic and behind-the-scenes support for the U.S. war efforts.
They're the ones digging into the arms deals, the Agent Orange production, all those things that make Canada look less like the good guy.
Exactly. They point to all that as evidence that Canada was more involved in the war than they wanted people to think. They're not afraid to talk about the contradictions and the things that make people uncomfortable.
It sounds like they're saying, don't just listen to what they say. Look at what they actually do.
You got it. And then we have the post-revisionists. They try to find a middle ground between those two opposing views. They recognize that Canada did both, spoke out against the war, and supported the U.S. behind the scenes. And they say it's important to consider the complex relationship between Canada and the U.S.
So less black and white, more shades of gray.
Exactly. They understand that Canada was in a tough spot. They had to keep their close relationship with the U.S. while also trying to do what was best for themselves, all during this super complicated war.
So it's more like, hey, there weren't really good guys and bad guys. Everyone was just trying to figure things out as they went.
That's a good way to put it. Finally, you have the new left historians. They take a more critical view. They argue that because Canada was making money from the U.S. military, they were basically supporting the war, even if they said they weren't.
So they think the economic side of things was the most important factor for Canada, more important than any moral or political concerns.
You got it. And they also look very closely at all the secret things Canada was doing, like intelligence sharing. And they say that those actions totally contradicted Canada's claims of being neutral and that they actually helped the U.S. war effort.
So for them, it's not just about the money. It's about Canada actively doing things that helped the war, even if it was indirectly.
Exactly. It's about looking beyond the official statements and figuring out what the real impact of their actions was, even the ones that were kept secret.
It's wild to think that one historical event can be interpreted in so many different ways. It really shows that there isn't just one truth when it comes to history. It's all about who's telling the story and how they see things.
And that's what makes studying history so cool. It's not just memorizing names and dates. It's about wrestling with these big questions, looking at the evidence and trying to figure out why people did what they did and what the consequences were.
It also reminds us to be careful about stories that sound too simple, especially when it comes to something as complicated as a whole country's role in a big war.
Absolutely. And speaking of complicated, I think it's worth spending a bit more time on one specific part of this whole history, the debate about Canada producing Agent Orange. This isn't just some historical footnote. It's something that still affects Canada's relationship with its Indigenous peoples today.
Oh, I didn't realize there was a connection there. Tell me more.
Well, during the Vietnam War, some companies in Canada made and tested Agent Orange at a military base in Gagetown, New Brunswick. And guess what? That base is right next to a community that belongs to the Maliseet First Nation.
Wait, so they were testing this super toxic chemical right next to an Indigenous community? That's terrible.
It is. And for decades now, people from the Maliseet community have been saying that they've had serious health problems, things like cancer and babies being born with birth defects. They think it's because of the Agent Orange testing that happened near them. They've been fighting for the government to acknowledge this and to compensate them for their suffering, but it's been a really hard fight.
This changes the whole story. Now, we're not just talking about debates between historians, we're talking about real people whose lives were directly affected by Canada's role in the Vietnam War.
It really drives home the point that war has consequences that can last for generations. And even countries that weren't directly involved in the fighting can still bear the scars of those wars. It also raises big questions about environmental justice and whether governments are doing enough to protect their people, especially communities that are already vulnerable.
It's like this one historical event, the Vietnam War, is still casting a shadow over Canada today. It's forcing them to think about the things they did in the past and what they need to do now to make things right.
It's a powerful example of how history isn't just something we read about in books. It's a force that's still shaping the world around us.
All right, so we've covered a lot in this deep dive. The diplomacy, the economic ties, the draft dodgers, the covert operations, the anti-war movement, the different ways historians understand it all, and even the lasting effects on Indigenous communities. But as we wrap up part 2, I'm still left with this one big question. What about the long-term impact on Canada's relationship with the U.S.? How did all these contradictions and complexities from the Vietnam War affect how they interacted with each other in the years that followed?
That's a great question. It's like we've peeled back all these layers of this historical onion, and now we're at the core, wondering about the ultimate consequences of Canada's actions.
It's crazy to think that something that happened so long ago, like the Vietnam War, can still have such a big impact on Canada. It really shows you that history isn't just some boring thing in the past. It's still affecting us today.
I totally agree. And when we look at how Canada's relationship with the U.S. changed after Vietnam, we see both things staying the same and things changing a lot. Even with all the tension and disagreement, they were still close allies. They were just too connected geographically, economically, and culturally to completely separate.
So they had to figure out how to deal with those differences over Vietnam while still keeping the bigger picture of the alliance in mind. But did they ever really deal with the issues that caused those problems in the first place?
Well, after the war, both countries had to kind of look at themselves in the mirror and think about what happened. The U.S. obviously had to face the really bad consequences of the war, both at home and around the world. They had to come to terms with all the lives that were lost, the political mess, and the moral questions the war raised.
What about Canada? What did they have to deal with? Did they ever admit that they were doing things that contradicted what they were saying?
It wasn't as obvious for Canada, but it was still important. They had to figure out how to hold on to their image as peacekeepers when they were also involved in the war. They had to face the fact that they were making money from the war, doing secret things, and that Indigenous communities were hurt by the Agent Orange testing.
When we started this deep dive, I thought Canada was pretty much just watching the Vietnam War happen from a distance. But now I see that they were really involved in ways that both helped and went against what the U.S. was doing. It's way more complicated than I realized.
That's what makes learning about history so great. It challenges what we think we know and makes us look at the past in new ways. And with Canada and the Vietnam War, it makes us think about national identity, moral responsibility, and how conflict can have long-lasting effects.
It also makes you wonder how what happened during Vietnam influenced Canada's foreign policy after that? Did they become more willing to stand up to the U.S.? Or did they keep trying to balance cooperation and disagreement?
Maybe that's a topic for another deep dive sometime, but I think it's safe to say that the Vietnam War was a huge turning point for Canada. It forced them to figure out their place in the world, how they related to the U.S., and what their values really were.
I think we've done a pretty good job of untangling this messy part of history. We looked at diplomacy, economics, personal stories, secret operations, protests, historical interpretations, and even the effects on Indigenous communities. I feel like I have a much better understanding of this part of history that a lot of people don't know much about.
I hope our listeners feel the same way. We've shown that Canada wasn't just sitting on the sidelines during the Vietnam War. They were right in the middle of it, and that involvement still affects them today.
It reminds us that history is rarely simple. It's full of contradictions, gray areas, and things that happen that nobody expected. And it's often in those messy parts that we find the most interesting and important truths.
So, as we finish up this deep dive into Canada's complicated role in the Vietnam War, we want to encourage you, our listeners, to keep exploring, keep asking questions, and don't be afraid to challenge the stories you hear. History is an amazing journey of discovery, and there's always more to learn and understand.
And who knows, maybe your own deep dive into history will uncover some surprising truths about the world and how we got here. Until next time, keep on diving.
Thanks for listening to Mr. Hutchings History. Keep exploring, and we'll see you next time.